ABC Radio National. I'll be hosting this panel discussion. Let me introduce you to our panellists for tonight. Beryl Booth is a Gunda Chamara and Gunai Kurnai elder. On her mother's side, she's a descendant of the Lovett family of Western Victoria. Now, you saw that name up here. A number of Lovett brothers enlisted in the First World War. Auntie Beryl has spent her life devoted to serving many prominent Aboriginal-run organisations, including the Victorian Indigenous Remembrance Committee. Ricky Morris is a Gunda Chamara man. He served in both the regular Army and Army Reserves from 1990 to 2005 on active duty in Afghanistan and East Timor. Ricky's also a member of the Lovett clan. His grandfather Frederick was one of those brothers who fought in the first AIF, and Ricky now works for Aboriginal Housing Victoria. Richard Franklin is a filmmaker, writer, singer, songwriter, and a Gunda Chamara man. Richard has worked on the front line of Indigenous issues for a few decades. And one of his films is Harry's War, which you may have seen tonight. It's showing before every performance here in the foyer, based on his uncle's experience in the Second World War on the Kokoda Trail. And Richard's also served in the Army, regular and reserve, the third generation of men in his family to do so. And Tom Wright is the writer of Black Diggers, originally from Melbourne. Tom's now based in Sydney, but we won't hold that against him. He was Artistic Associate and Associate Director at Sydney Theatre Company from 2004 to 2012, and he's written a number of plays as well as reinterpreted a number of classic plays. Tom was invited by Wesley Enoch, the Artistic Director of Queensland Theatre Company and the Director of Black Diggers, to collaborate on the creation of the work. Now, Gary Foley was going to join us tonight also. Unfortunately, he's not well and so can't be with us, which is a shame, but we will soldier on. Perhaps Richard and Ricky and Beryl, I could get you to start, because of the particular experiences you've had with your own families. I'd love to get your response, just briefly, first of all, to this show, to Black Diggers, as a piece of theatre that reflects stories. Beryl?
Oh, wow. Oh, here we go. That's me all over. Look, I was very touched. I was sitting down here in the front. I seem to always end up in the front. So it got me so emotional that I could and did relate to a lot of the scenes that were happening back then, especially with the young fella that came back disturbed, going off. Look, I had involvement with my uncles, not the granduncles, the uncles that came back from 3 different wars, 3 brothers from Grandad. One particular, Uncle Mick, he came back from Korea and he lived with Mum and Dad in Melbourne here, Fitzroy. And when he came back, he wasn't the same person that went. He used to be then happy-go-lucky, easygoing, but when he came back from that Korean War, he never had no children. He had his 21st over there in Korea. I think all his nieces and nephews were his family. But having said that, he came back totally different. We didn't know at the time whether he was going to give us a whack or a clip under there or kung fu, because he was a bit not with it, if you know what I mean. So we loved him because we didn't know what had happened. So we backed off, all the nieces and nephews from Uncle Mick back then. But he brought the war home, if you know what I mean. We had it in our home. That did happen with his other brothers. He had 2 other brothers that went to war too. And they came back different, and they never married either. So my granddad had 6 sons, love it boys, but only one married and had children. The other didn't because they weren't capable, or they just didn't want a relationship. So we became, with all the children, which is a big mob of nieces and nephews, they sort of seen us as the children, and that's how we sort of seen them as like fathers that needed somebody around them, whether it was children or not. And I think we loved them, and I think they thought that they could just clip us under the ear roll or give that, or a kung fu chop. But yeah, so that happened. And can I go?
Yeah, no, let's just, Ricky, can I get your impressions, thoughts on the show?
Yeah, certainly. For me, watching the show last night, and it was a fantastic show to watch, and I think you all agree to that. It was storyline was fantastic, and for me, I related on a lot of different levels. As a veteran, served in East Timor and Afghanistan, so I related a lot of the stuff, and I think the one that does particularly me was the I Spy of My Little Lie, because in conflict, 95% of the time you're bored, but that 5% of the time it was just pure adrenaline and very hellish and scary moments. So the I Spy of My Little Lie was something that I related to. But the other thing that really related to me, and I think it's, I can tell the story of my family, the Lovett family, but it's got to do with Uncle Harry Saunders, with Uncle Richard. He is stories, movies about. I was in New Guinea a couple of years ago, and I thought I'll go to the war cemetery and see if I can find Uncle Harry's headstone. And I went to the cemetery and had a look at the cemetery from the top of the hill, and there's just white crosses everywhere. And I thought, this fella could be here anywhere, to myself. And so I walked down and I was looking on the headstones, and they just had unknown Australian soldier. And I thought, oh, they haven't even got their names on these white crosses. And I walked down halfway down towards the building at the front, which had the plot book there that you could check in and see where the names were. And I just stopped about halfway down, and I just turned to the bloke to my left who was with me, and I just said, this fella could be here anywhere. And I looked down to my right-hand side at the headstone there, and there was Uncle Harry Saunders' headstone. It's as if the Gunditjmara spirit tapped me on the shin and said, here I am here, Uncle. So that was special, and I took that away from me from that story today.
Yeah, that's amazing. Richard, you've just seen the show tonight.
I served twice. But I never went to combat as a soldier, but I went to 2 wars, and the weapon I carried was a camera, and one was in the Middle East. It was a pretty hard game because you sort of won out. It was just me and another blackfella. And you've seen a lot of horrible stuff. And the other war for me was the Royal Commission. And I did that 4 years, and I was the only blackfella. It was pretty hard going. And, you know, being a blackfella, you get a lot of trauma in your life anyway in this country. But I took away a lot of things from the play tonight. I seen a different respect in the audience than I've seen before. A lot of times people place soldiers or people with scars in their soul as a problem, but it's a problem that's been created. We're not a problem. We've had a problem thrust upon us. I guess anything that gets the message out there, I believe that when you've got art, you've got voice. And when you've got voice, you've got freedom. And with freedom comes responsibility. And one of the reasons that all of us here are free in some way, shape and form is because a whole heap of blackfellas died. They died at the first point of conflict when our cultures clashed. And then they went overseas and they died and they served, and some came home. And we're very grateful for what they did. It made me sad and angry to see the show, made me full of immense pride, made me tribal proud because us Gunditjmara mob, we're known as the Fighting Gunditjmara, and we like to cross the street to have a fight, and if the fight's on the other side, we'll cross back and have it there. I guess that's the 5 Uncle Lovett brothers. They fought in the First World War and the Second World War. They sort of let them know we were about. My grandfather, he was with them in the First World War, and Uncle Reg and Uncle Harry was with them in the Second World War. And then Uncle Reg was in Korea, first Aboriginal commissioned officer. And then Ricky in Afghanistan. I just seen a lot of family up there, and before they weren't seen, they were invisible. Before I made the film Harry's War, we were invisible, all of us. You'd go into the RSL, and I remember one year I went and put flowers down, and the only blokes thrown out of the RSL was me, a former black soldier, and 2 white fellas in wheelchairs, and they were former soldiers. So it was the cripples and the black fella thrown out. We went to the next pub and we got thrown into that too.
Tom, can I get you to talk about choices you made with this play? I mean, we've been hearing about particular people, particular direct stories, but you've chosen not to be directly biographical with this play, to base it on real people and real events, but to kind of meld and mix and not use real names. Can you tell us about making those sort of choices?
The reason why was out of respect. I didn't want to write a story taking on board families' tradition, understanding or history, and through simple error or through what theatre does, misrepresent a story that was of enormous truth to the living, let alone the dead. So although everything you saw on stage is based upon the enormous body of research that's gone into black service in the First World War, I did deliberately change the names because I wanted it to be clear that this is an exercise of a society, black and white, coming to an understanding about something bigger than any one individual. Individuals have to make the contribution, and we're there in the mud and blood and in the trenches, but fundamentally there was also sociological phenomenon at work here. And I guess the big one there that I was aware of is that on one level what you're looking at is archetypes that white Australia is very familiar with, the slouch hat, the blokes at Gallipoli, the Sphinx and all of that kind of stuff, which has almost become so, through rigmarole, has reached the point of cliche, and if you're not overdosed on it this week, you will be by Monday. There's that sense that we've got to be very careful with our legacy there. But the difference here is, of course, is we're putting black faces into those cliches. We're reminding everybody in the community and everybody in the nation that this sacrifice that's continually flung in our faces wasn't just a sacrifice of the elite of society, is that there's a black side to this story. And as a result, I wanted to make sure that it was quite clear that that wasn't just spot cases. It's a big story. And I'm conscious of the danger involved in that. I was conscious all the way through. There's a big difference between the white bloke who walks into the recruiting tent in 1915 and joins up and goes off and gets his head blown off, and his black mate. The black mate had been fighting, and his father and his grandfather had been fighting since 1788 for land anyway. For them it was one long continuous experience of war for land. And to suddenly have the schoolmaster or the pastor or someone from your town come and start wagging their finger in your face and start talking about land and what do you want to do to fight for your country and so on, the irony must have been so rich they could barely bear it. And yet these blokes went into uniform and went off and fought in foreign lands anyway. There's a big difference there, but I would hope that that tension is present in the play, and for that reason I wanted to make sure that we're entering the realm of the mythic and not getting too caught up in the individual stories. So to finish off, there's that monologue that the ghost talks about what it's like to storm those machine gun nests. That's clearly based as close as I can get it on William Irwin, who lost his life there the day after his remarkable effort. But I didn't want to put that name to him. I wanted it to be a story which the community owned and not just one bloke.
Richard, what's your take on why these young Indigenous men joined the first AIF to serve in Gallipoli and on the Western Front? Why they joined? I guess to fight for a country that didn't recognise them as citizens.
They weren't recognised as human. I mean, they were treated, the stories I've been told that have been passed down, people were treated like subhuman. I mean, even when I was a boy, it was pretty much the same. When I joined up the first time, the blokes weren't too bad. I mean, you'd get these jokes where you'd be doing a lesson and they'd draw a cave with a couple of dots in. They'd say, "What's that?" "Oh, that's Franco's eyes." And line up A company, and you black bastard, get on the end. And you'd end up in a blue, of course. And the second time I joined up, they'd go out boong bashing and coon kicking, and I'd wait for them and I'd fight them, because I was a bit of a feisty fella. And but then on the flip side of it, I made some of the best mates I've ever got. I'm still in contact with them. They get very concerned about me and the work I do. They ring up. They land on your doorstep with a feed and a bit of a yarn. I got in a blue a few years ago with some fellas who were a bit rough, and all these blokes in their mid-40s turned up wanting to fight them all. They came from all around Australia, and I just said, "Look, you're fat and you're old now." I said, "Behave yourself." No, but that's... I think you joined for equality, and you joined in the hope that you'd change the world. Some joined for adventure. Some joined simply because it was an escape from the mundane routine of seeing discrimination all around them. I mean, this was a time when communication around the world was sparse. A person, what they knew in a newspaper then, we know at the click of a button. What they knew in a year then about the world, we know at the click of a button. We're so overwhelmed with information. So these men heard rumours and innuendo about what the world was like. They heard that there was black people overseas. And the quest for adventure for any young man at that time must have been incredibly strong. For me, I joined because of family tradition, and I knew that if I didn't get somewhere safe, that the racism that I was seeing in broader society was going to break. I was going to break and snap. And the other reason I joined, I was madly in love with a girl who died, and I thought the army was a safe place for a bloke that was grieving a bit.
Wow. Ricky,
She was a bloody spunk too, just quietly.
Ricky, the sports writer Martin Flanagan, he says that the footy field, Aussie rules, has been and is one of the few places in this country where black and white Australians look at each other on equal terms. And as I think this play shows, the battlefields of faraway wars are another one of those sites. How was your own experience as a soldier? How was it similar or different to those of the Indigenous soldiers who fought in the first AIF?
Yeah, I guess for me, one thing I learnt when the first bullet went over my head, that bullets don't discriminate. Okay, they'll grab hold of anyone, and they don't care if you're black, white or brindle. So that's one thing you learn pretty quickly, and you had your wits about you when you went outside the wire, so to speak. I always see Granddad's first enlistment. He tried to join in 1914 when war broke out, and on his enlistment papers he was declined because he was not a British subject. That's what his enlistment papers said. So after Gallipoli and the slaughter fields of France, he tried again. He had another crack at this because the adventure was there. It's an adventure until the first bullet goes over your head. Then it's reality, and you wish you were back home in Gunditjmara country. But the second time Grandad tried to join, all of a sudden it was stamped on his enlistment payment of significant British origin. So he was right. So off he went. He was all of a sudden of significant British origin, so he could go and fight for the Commonwealth and for King and Country. I always think this story is either side of your time in the services. You know, as you said, you meet some good mates. You have some good old blues. You have your own experiences of racism and that. But it's the journey either side of that for Aboriginal people that I think is the story that I got out of this play as well. I done an oral history story once with an old veteran, Uncle Ken Cobung from Western Australia. He was an engineer. The army and the wisdom. I've got all my family connections down here in Victoria. I'm a Koori from Victoria, so as a Defence Force recruiter doing Indigenous recruitment, what does the army send me to? Noongar country, where I know no one. So I'm over there trying to make networks and that. So I caught up with Uncle Ken Cobung. He was an engineer. I was an engineer. We both served in the army, so I thought that was a good connection. And he told me the story of his service in World War II and also in Korea. And he said to me, "You know, Rick, the closer I got home, the blacker I became again." And that has stuck with me ever since. Yeah.
Well, Beryl, I suppose you know, despite many of these men finding out on their return that nothing had changed for them, do you think that their service, their participation, the coming together of that diversity of soldiers on the battlefields, did that make a difference, do you think? Has that made a difference in the longer run towards rights, towards reconciliation?
Now, I certainly do. I think with myself and my parents growing up on east of Victoria, the other one on the west, I was virtually born and bred in Melbourne, which was Fitzroy, rough and about. But in those days, the uncles I'm talking about, the 2-3 uncles that did go to war in Fitzroy, they also went to school with the community, the men and women. And they became buddies from school back then, and they all of them joined the Navy. I did have a cousin in the Navy. I don't know why I'm thinking of Colin. I hope he's alive. Anyway, they went to school, so they enlisted in the Korean War. Uncle Jim enlisted in, I can't think of the bloody war, but anyway, they
Another
enlisted.
one of those bloody wars.
Yeah, one of those bloody wars. But the point is that these school kids that went to school with my uncles, and I went to school with some of them, they also joined the Korean War. So they were mates from school. They were mates even from white ones, schoolmates, joined the Vietnam War. And those ones that joined the Vietnam that I know back then, they're still my friends today. I went to school with them. They often ring me up today, still think we're all mates from school. But these are soldiers that went to war with my uncles who were Korean. And then the next wave was the Vietnam, which around about my age in the 60s when the draft happened. Now, today, all those people that were in our lives back then from primary school right through, and I can say this for my uncles who ain't here today, that they had great companions right through, yes, and they could get into the RSL. I am a member, have been a member of the RSL for years. But the point is the respect that came from an urban area such as Fitzroy, which was rough and tough. The boys have talked about fighting. Yeah, well, you go to the right place and live in the right place, you become that. But that is still there today, that staunchness, whether they were black or white, it was there. And it's still there today. You learn the hard way, and I truly believe in life, and it's sad, you don't get too much respect from other people's if you're black. The only way you get respect, and I had to fight for it too, and I never wore a bloody army uniform, but people would always call me and other people dirty niggers, dirty this, dirty that, but I knew how to fight my way, probably because it was already in my blood. So I had my own war, same with everybody else here, had a war of just trying to be a human and walk down the street, ride on the bus or whatever, sit in a picture theatre. We had that, but we had to fight for it. And I wasn't the only girl. The boys could always take care of themselves, but it was there. It's always a fight. So we didn't have to go overseas. We were fighting here our own war.
Yes, exactly.
Thank you.
Exactly. Tom, just something that Beryl just said raises a question for me too. Did you find any women Indigenous women who joined up the first AIF?
Well, women couldn't join the AIF, obviously. There is one recorded instance of an Indigenous woman who served in the First World War, but in a classic Australian story, she had to leave Australia, go to the UK, go to Canada and join the Canadian Nursing Corps in order to actually get service. So the only black woman that the War Memorial in Canberra has on record who served in the First World War actually had to do it in another Commonwealth nation. She wasn't actually able to here. Broadly speaking, though, the point's right. This is a very male story, male black story and male Australian story as well. I think that's why Wesley, as the director, made the decision to make it an all-Indigenous cast, even though on occasions some of the blokes are going to play women and going to play the female elders, who are a very important part of that story. And I think this is a big thing that we can pick up from Beryl's observation here, is that there's two sides to it. There's the stuff that goes on in Flanders and at Passchendaele and at Polygon Wood and all that, but for every bloke that's there putting his life on the line, there's a wife and a potential wife and a mother and an auntie back at home who has to keep the community together. And then 1918 comes around, suddenly rah-rah, the British Empire is put back together again. Black blokes get home. Most of them have what we nowadays know as post-traumatic stress disorder, but at that time you were just told to get on with it. And usually it fell upon the women to actually try and keep the communities together. The ones that, as the alcoholism kicked in and as the various other forms of stress kicked in, the women had to fight a war which went on much longer than the 4 years that we talk about. So this big theme that's coming out tonight is the core thing, is that we like to talk about war as moments in time. That's how governments like to talk about it. But actually, once the cork's taken out of the bottle, it's very hard to put back in again. And to a certain extent, as I think this week's demonstrating, we're all still living out this kind of ongoing open scab that just keeps getting opened over and over again. And the healing process takes multiple generations.
It'd be nice to invite some questions from you. I think we've got time for a few questions. So if you'd like to, I think we have microphones. Yes. So, yep, great.
Ricky, would you see this play as a recruiting tool for your role in recruiting Indigenous soldiers?
No, my time as a recruiter was many years ago, and I certainly I've seen the play for what it was. It's telling the story of black soldiers that went to war and the experiences they had while they were at war, and certainly when they came home after war. If it tells a story, and it certainly invites the individual to have a look at a career in the Defence Force, it's up to the individual. But I didn't see it as a recruiting tool myself personally.
Okay. Tom, can I just ask you, while we're waiting for another question, if anyone else does want to ask a question? I can't see any hands up at the moment. I'm sure you're well aware there are sensitivities around who tells whose stories. What convinced you as a non-Indigenous person to take on this project?
Because I was invited. I would never presume to write this material if I wasn't invited to, not just by black artists but also by black elders, and the consultative process was exhaustive on this one, talking to communities all over Australia, Rawkan and all over the place, and so I didn't feel that sense of privilege that often accompanies the arts, where everybody carries on about their own creativity and wants to get their own story off their chest or wants to impart a great message. I really tried as hard as I could to listen, to read the research and to serve the blokes who actually had to make the show in the room. And so the 9 actors that you saw tonight on stage, plus 2 who did previous tours, plus Ruby Langton Batty who designed the costumes, you're seeing a large body of Indigenous creativity up there. And this isn't about me. I really did just try very hard to provide the resource material that they could then use to make a story. And I was conscious of the fact as well that I had to serve time as well as community. There's a big point about this, is that no one stays trapped in time. It goes to my earlier point about how things move across generations. to be black in 1914 is on one level exactly the same as what it is now, as I understand it. On another level, it can never be. And so I tried very hard to get in things such as the role that religious faith played at that time, that perhaps it doesn't quite as much anymore. Those blokes tended to come from Lutheran communities, Methodist communities, Catholic communities. Religion, white man's religion, was a salve, and to a certain extent was also a blanket that was placed over them that got in between them and the spirituality of their elders. Everything was complicated, and the more work I did, the more I realised how out of my depth I was. And as a result, I just tried to write these short, sharp scenes and get across a sense of a shell-shocked culture, a scattergun culture, not a long, sustained, heroic movie like Gallipoli or anything like that. Some of the scenes wanted to be over almost before they began, like a memory that wasn't quite sure of what it was grasping.
Do we have another question? Okay, we'll just got microphones. No, so people up the back can hear you too.
I think that one of the things that affected me was the ongoing effects, the after effects of war. There was just the letter that was read out about the Coniston massacre, which was it's a part of Australian history which is so rarely spoken about. But it did strike me as being something that is such a horrible after effect of war. I'm just wondering, I wonder if this is something else that we can talk about in Australia.
Richard, we'll get you.
I lobbied in the 90s pretty hard for the War Memorial and the then Prime Minister John Howard to get the massacres and the battles, because not just massacres, there were a lot of battles at first point of contact recognised. And the War Memorial, after a lot of pressure, sent a policy to me saying, I'd said that they had a policy, that they only recognised wars where Australians had actually served overseas. And I thought that cut Broome out, and it cut Darwin out, and it cut that type of stuff. But you're talking about places like the Convincing Ground. You're talking the 600 warriors who charged down Battle Hill on Kalkadoon country just out of Mount Isa. These people have never been thoroughly recognised, and I was severely attacked by the Howard government despite only writing letters. My retort to the Howard government at the time was to executive produce a film called After Mabo the Amendments, where we sent several hundred copies to the United Nations and the Committee for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. As a result of that film, or part of that film contributed to that committee investigating John Howard and having findings against him for legislative discrimination. To my mind, the part of the problem we have in this country is we live with a nursery version of history. We fail to recognise the past, and when we do that, we can't grapple with the contemporary happenings. And when we can't grapple with the contemporary happenings, we can't plant a seed for our future generations. And we're in denial of the identity, which means we're in denial of who we can be. And who we can be is a great country.
The thing about the Coniston massacre, obviously, and I think it's a good... The reason why Coniston's in the show is because Douglas Grant, who was a Murray soldier of complicated background, when he did come back after the war, wrote letter after letter after letter trying to draw attention to the Sydney and East Coast public about what was going on up at the Territory. The point being is that massacres, battles and fighting on Australian soil had taken place in the preceding century before the First World War, but it didn't stop there. And that old lie about, we're going to fight the war to end all wars, isn't just about international global politics, it applies to Australia as well. 14 years after the outbreak after Archduke Franz is shot, we have at Coniston the same old battles going on. But there were ex-servicemen, men wearing the RSL badge, trying to draw attention, trying to get people to understand what was happening at these... The process of colonisation, the frontier was still extant well into the 20th century and arguably is still going on at the moment. This is the big point about the continuing war. And what service in the army has given generations of Australian black men, as far as I can observe, is an understanding of the nature of the way white men fight. And when that's a useful tool, you can turn it back. You can turn it back on white society and actually start fighting, not just with your fists, but also start fighting, well, as Richard's just described.
Ladies and gentlemen, we do need to wind up this session, I think.
Do you mind if I just
do you want to
say
add something,
is that okay?
Richard? Certainly.
I'm head of the Willen department at VCA Melbourne Uni, and we've got a whole heap of young people coming in, and the gun they're using is art, and they're changing attitudes using art. And I'd encourage every one of you, if you know some young Koories or even senior Koories, send them along. We want to recruit. We want to get them out
You're the
there.
recruiting officer.
Absolutely. We want them doing plays like this. We want to make them movies. We want them out there changing the world. I think the greatest thing that the greatest tool that we've had is not just our servicemen and women, it's our artists, because our artists have contributed just as much to the identity of this nation as any man, jack or dog. And I'd say send them down. We want them, and you'll see them with a paintbrush, you'll see them with a camera, with a microphone, with a song. We want to tell our stories through our eyes. We've got the ability, we've got the capability, and we've got the bloody need.
Good on you. Well, with so much commemoration around centenary anniversaries from the start of the First World War last year, the centenary of that, to the Gallipoli landing anniversary coming up this Saturday, to supermarket ads about diggers fresh in our memories. It's hard not to feel overwhelmed by all of that. I have to say, though, that towards the end of this show, at that point where the members of the cast start putting up the letters that make up "Lest We Forget" on these back walls, at that point and through what we've seen in this play, those words take on a remarkable additional and very powerful meaning, I think. Don't you think? Certainly. Yeah. Thank you for being here tonight. Will you please join me in thanking the 4 panellists who've so generously joined us? Beryl Booth, Ricky Morris, Richard Franklin and Tom Wright. And thanks to you.